On behalf of everyone at Zion Lutheran Church, welcome. May God bless your time with us today. This reading is from the 9th chapter of John's Gospel. All of the stories in John are long. In fact, every chapter is a separate story. So rather than read the whole 9th chapter of John, I'll give you instead a summary, a synopsis. Here is how what John records in chapter 9, here's how it goes. One day, Jesus saw a man who had been blind from the day he was born. And Jesus' disciples asked him, whose fault was it that he was blind? Who caused it? Who sinned? Jesus said, you're asking the wrong question. Instead, you should watch and see what God will do. Jesus then took mud and washed the man's eyes with mud, sent him to the healing pool, and the man came back and he could see. Here's part 2. All of this man's neighbors said, what happened? You used to be blind. You used to beg at the city gate. You can't be the same guy. And the man who was healed kept saying, I am he. And so his neighbors said, this doesn't make sense. How could this happen? And the man said, I don't know. I did as Jesus asked, and now I can see. Well, the leaders said, that can't be because Jesus is a lawbreaker. There's no way he could have made this happen. And the man said, I think he's a great prophet. Here's part 3. Well, the neighbors were frustrated with the man, so they called his parents. They called his dad and mom. They said, what's going on? How could this be? How could your blind son now see? And they said, we don't know. Why don't you ask him? So they went back to this man again, and they said, tell us. Tell the truth. Jesus could not have done this. He's a sinner. The man said, all I know is I was blind, and now I can see. Well, then the leaders said, we don't know what this Jesus is doing. We don't know how he could do it. It doesn't make sense. And the man said, well, you worry about who he is and how he does what he does. All I know is that he healed me. So then they said to him, you're a sinner too. And they threw him out and said, don't come back to this village again. Part 4. Jesus went and found the man and said, do you believe in the Messiah? And the man said, yes, just show me who he is so I can believe. And Jesus said, I am he. I remember once when I was a little kid, I woke up in the middle of the night standing at our picture window. My dad was shaking me, telling me to wake up. I I'd been sleepwalking. I was shouting at the window. Now, how in the world can someone see when they're asleep? How could you walk with your eyes closed? Obviously, I had. I don't understand that. On the other hand, all of us know the experience of driving on a familiar highway that we've driven so many times, and all of a sudden we've gone miles and miles and realized we weren't even aware of what was around us. How can we not see when our eyes are open? Those are the questions that this text raises for me. Today's a chance to think about our own faith life. Are we awake or asleep? Are our eyes open or closed? You know the story of Mary and Martha and Lazarus. Lazarus was the brother who died, and 4 days later Jesus came and raised him back to life out of the tomb. But the very first thing they said to Jesus when he showed up was, if you had been there before he died, he wouldn't have died. How could you let this happen? Why did you take your time coming? Why were you so slow? You see, they knew he loved Lazarus. They didn't understand how he could let Lazarus die. They had no problem with him raising him to life. They believed he was capable of anything, but why would he let that happen? That was their question. It sounds like our question. How smart do we think we are? And how often are we surprised by what appears to be impossible? You know, like this story of this blind beggar who suddenly could see. Everyone wanted to say it can't be, even though he could see. And they just didn't believe it. How smart do we think we are? How often are we surprised by what appears to be impossible? Now, I talked about Lazarus. Jesus showed up at his tomb 4 days after he died. Everyone had given up hope. The funeral was over. They still were in the midst of their time of mourning and grief. They had given up hope. But Jesus hadn't even started yet. But he would. So that raises an interesting question we must never forget, and that is this: how often are God's ways different than ours? Why do we assume that God should do it our way rather than waiting and seeing what God will do or what God has already done? If you could go back to any Bible stories you want, you'll see this same pattern about how things change in ways that no one would have expected when touched by God's love. You know the story of Joseph. His brothers sold him, threw him in a pit. A caravan traders bought him. He wound up in a jail in Egypt. And yet somehow he wound up becoming the most powerful ruler in Egypt and wound up saving all of his family. Now, who would have seen that one coming? Or think about Moses. Moses had a speech impediment. He was nervous. He was shy. And yet, he wound up standing face to face with the most powerful Pharaoh, the most powerful ruler of Egypt. Now, how could have that happened? Who would have seen that coming? King Saul didn't think David could do anything with Goliath. Even the prophet Samuel, who was sent to anoint David as king, said, "He's too young, he's too little." And yet, David became the greatest king of all. Think about the stories in the New Testament. The story of the Good Samaritan. A guy was wounded by robbers, left for dead. The holy people, the priest and Levite, wouldn't stop. The ones who said, "We're all about God," wouldn't stop for a wounded fellow Jew. But a Samaritan, guy from another country, stopped and helped the man. Who would have seen that coming? Or, the greatest story of all, God came to earth not as a king in a palace, but a baby in a little town called Bethlehem. And then later on, the Romans thought that Jesus had died on a cross. And yet 3 days later, the tomb was empty. And then there was Saul, who became Paul. Saul, who was so righteous and so sure of how the Jewish faith should be lived, he persecuted Christians, had them thrown in jail, even helped make sure some of them died. And yet, of all people, he became the greatest witness of Christ. Sometimes God's ways don't make sense. Sometimes God's ways take time. God's ways often are different than ours. How often do we fail to see the wonder and mystery and majesty in life because we don't appreciate the ordinary? We make things so complicated. How often do we reject the good news because its music wasn't as obvious as a marching band? How often do we ignore love and true beauty because it doesn't glare right in our face or doesn't make a lot of noise and demand a lot of attention? It is so easy to judge a book by its cover or fail to see God at work in the beauty of a lily or the complexity of a tiny, one-celled amoeba. You see, the world looks for certain attributes, judged to be signs of success, or power, or might. And the result of the world's way are wars, failed economies, broken marriages, and leaders who can't figure out how to lead. Do not miss the wonder of God because of the average. Don't let the miraculous skip you by because of the common, because of what you take for granted. Subtlety and restraint, we believe, are signs of good taste, right? Well, God has good taste. For God has put wonder into the ordinary. God's ways are not our ways. This story from John 9, and I really would encourage you to read that whole chapter, is really three different stories going on at the same time, just like happens every day in life. The first part of the story was, well, whose fault? I mean, give me a break. Instead of helping a blind man, they want to just argue about, why is he blind? Who sinned? Was it his dad, his mom? I wonder what they did. This must be a punishment because of something someone did, something went wrong. And then the guy can see. And they go, oh no, don't believe it. I've never seen anything like this. These people had healthy eyes, but they couldn't see anything. Well, the next part of the story was with the parents. All of these people went running to dad and mom and tried to make it all about them. Said, what's going on with your son? You got to straighten him out. Tell us what's happening. Now think about parents whose child had always been blind. Now he could see, and they were being put on trial. And they were so afraid of the wrath of those leaders who lived in darkness that the joy of a healing was stolen from them by the power of sin. Now, at the very beginning of the story, the guy's healed. This is the third part. He can see. And they kept coming back and asking questions and making him talk. And finally, at the end, he gets it. Not only can he can see Jesus. He has faith. It took a while. He got it right. What a powerful story. And how much it is like everyday life. And even in the process of healing, this story helps us see things that are very easy to miss. There's so much humor and irony in the Gospels. Now, here's a guy that's blind, and to heal him, Jesus rubbed mud in his eyes. Does that even make sense? To make it harder to see? How silly. To put mud on blind eyes. And yet, it reenacted the gift of creation. Remember that story in Genesis where God reached into the earth, and he picked up clay and he breathed into it. He made mud out of it and then created a man and breathed into it, and there was life. This story from John's Gospel is almost like that story of creation. Mud was shaped, and with breath there was life and vision and faith. Not used to what we're seeing. And yet that's how God revives and resuscitates life. Now, the best part of this story is the last line where it says the man left his darkness behind and then told everyone what he could see. Ephesians 5:14 says, "Sleeper, awake, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you." What a great message this is. Think about it as we think about how appearances can be deceiving. Even if eyes are open, without Christ, there is no vision, no light, no life. And even when eyes are closed by the darkness of sin, by faith, we can see Christ. Now, this man who was healed left his darkness behind. The crowd kept struggling with their need to control the facts and complain about the healing and blaming the parents and suggesting maybe the man was never really blind. And all that proves is that people can be so comfortable living in the darkness that they are like cave dwellers who are scared of the light. But unless one steps into the light, no matter how bright the sun might be, there's no way to see, and no way the glow of the sun can reflect off your life. Remember what Paul wrote about in 1 Corinthians 1. God always chooses the foolish and the weak things of the world to confound the wise. Appearances can be deceiving. Consider the example of the atom. Something we've never seen. It is too little. The tremendous power which we fear in our world is not the flow of great rivers or the floods they cause. It's not the might of the tide as it pushes millions of tons of ocean water forward and then draws it back again. It's not the flash of lightning or the crack of thunder. What fears us the most is something so small we cannot see it. It's the atom we fear. And it is the atom which has the unlimited power to destroy the world. What would seem to be the weakest thing in the world, in reality, is an unbelievably powerful force. Appearances can be deceiving, can't they? Remember how the world has been changed by a man who was judged to be only the son of a carpenter? And how the world said, oh, that story has ended. He has failed when he was sealed in a tomb. Yeah. Appearances can be deceiving. Who can imagine the power that gathers for worship on a Sunday morning? Who can measure the work of God that is accomplished every week by people who live by faith? And even if others don't hear about it, or maybe don't even care, the work goes forward. And it gets done by ordinary people with an extraordinary faith. How often does illness seem insurmountable? And yet, death has already been destroyed. Remember God's words to Samuel when he was looking for a king? He said, don't consider his appearance or his height. The Lord doesn't look at the things people look at. People look at the outward. The Lord looks into the heart. God loves you. And because you are loved, you are greater than King David and called to join Jesus in helping the light to shine. Remember Bethlehem in a manger, or the finality of a cross, a sealed tomb that became empty? Isn't it wonderful that with God, appearances are always deceiving, and what might seem to be controlled by darkness is always changed by the light? Sleeper, awake, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. The people of Zion Lutheran Church, thank you for sharing this time with us. We pray that God will bless you with his healing and hope. Zion is located at the intersection of Bronson Boulevard and Crosstown Parkway in Kalamazoo. Please know, you are always welcome at Zion.